Meadows. Was there ever such a word to so completely conjure up the very essence of the pastoral idyll? Was there ever such a scene as rolling swathes of modestly standing shrubbery to so embody unbounded, peaceful, untouched nature? And so this planet appeared to be, at least at these latitudes, a pleasant but otherwise unremarkable beauty spot. This meadow stretched across many miles of near-flat plains, augmented by the occasional modest hillock. The vegetation here seemed a monoculture, bushes looking much like those of the earthly rose, right up to their white-petalled buds and blooms, covered almost every square metre of these gentle pastures. Towards the edges of this garden realm, more expansive vegetation could be seen, trees and the like, along with a wider variety of foliage, climbing where the land became more hilly, tending towards mountainous in parts. But were these lowland meadows truly the stuff of nature? While the word might inspire nothing more than dreamy walks in the wild on Earth, Gallifrey, or countless other settled worlds, were they ever truly anything other than the intervention of man or other cultivating influences? Were these meadows ever untrammelled by the feet of mankind? On this world we had yet to see. There was a rustling in the white-flowered bushes. Had one of them disappeared? Whatever had occurred was dwarfed by what happened next. A roughly 4-metre square patch of meadow underwent a most brutal and repeated trammelling by a sizable blue box wheezing in and out of existence before finally utterly crushing the flora underneath. The feet and hands of Gallifrey at work. One door of the TARDIS popped open to reveal the heads of the Doctor, Romana and K9. The companions breathed deeply of the fresh summer air, smiling with satisfaction. Well, all but K9, of course. He simply clicked word and flash to himself. "What a wonderful, peaceful getaway," the Doctor gushed. "We should probably leave at once." He then added gravely. Romana raised an eyebrow and pursed her lips at him.
"Because you sense some dark and hidden presence?"
she asked sceptically.
"Or the opposite?"
The Doctor frowned, looking both grumpy and caught out. "Well, the latter, actually." Romana chuckled at him.
"I thought so. Look, Doctor, we have all of time and space stretching before us. I think we can spare 5 minutes for a stroll in the country, don't you?"
The Doctor gave a twisted smile of defeat. "Of course, Romana. I shall do my best to stoically bear the peace and quiet." With that, Romana and the Doctor stepped from the TARDIS, surrounded by nature. K9 made to follow them, but the Doctor held up his hand, staying his advance. "Wait, K9. It looks a little overgrown out here. Best you stay behind." K9 whirred and chattered in what almost sounded like irritation.
"Master? Mistress? I'm perfectly capable of flight,"
he began. The Doctor raised one finger sternly. No, K9. Best to remain guarding the TARDIS," he ordered. Then he leaned towards Romana and whispered behind his hand, "Plus, we wanted a little peace and quiet, didn't we?" Romana giggled.
"Affirmative, Master, Mistress. I shall endeavour to ensure no flowers break into the TARDIS."
With that, K9 trundled back inside and closed the doors. Finally freed from flashing lights and clattering gears, the two Time Lords now pushed on leisurely into the luscious sunlit meadow. Romana noticed just how much they had to push.
"The vegetation is remarkably dense,"
she remarked.
"It certainly makes it tougher going. Lucky we're not in a hurry."
The Doctor smiled indulgently. Don't let this picture of pastoral perfection deceive you. I'm pretty sure we're in a primitive world, untouched by the hands of farmers or gardeners." Romana waggled her head noncommittally.
"Perhaps. And yet these bushes do seem strangely uniform. Possibly not in their spacing, though with this being so close it's hard to tell. But their height is unusually consistent, all topping out around our chests, which does at least give us a wonderfully uninterrupted view,"
she conceded in conclusion. The Doctor nodded in a relaxed manner. Yes. The height alone does give a vague impression of horticultural management. But there are many species in the universe, flora and fauna, who show a stolid constancy in their adult dimensions. I dare say even Gallifreyans or humans might seem much of a monoculture when compared to some of the more extremely varied organisms we've encountered, even just on those 2 planets alone. Romana nodded in slow agreement, if with a hint of reservation. Then her eye was caught by a rustling and shaking of the bushes to the right of them.
Doctor, look!
She hissed, pointing in the direction of the disturbance. His head snapped around, but only in time to catch the merest hint of movement in the leaves and stems. "What was it, Romana? What did you see?" he asked, frowning slightly. Romana returned his frown, equally puzzled it seemed.
I'm not sure. I thought I saw a plant like the others, but a fraction taller. Only a few centimeters to be fair, but I thought I saw it. Only now I'm wondering if I imagined it.
The doctor continued to frown, but also showed some amusement at his companion's consternation. "Why, Romana, it's not like you to be seeing things, although that is rather the purpose of our visit. And with that in mind, why don't we take a closer look?" Romana inclined her head, and together they eased their way through the undergrowth in the direction of the now vanished movement. They knew they had arrived by what they found there. However, the mystery had deepened rather than cleared. One of the bushes had been torn apart. Its many flowers lay scattered upon the ground, radiating outwards from what was left of its central stem. No single branch remained attached, and these distressed members were similarly dashed to the four winds, many showing signs of having been stripped of their leaves. Even the central stem itself was nothing more than a broken stump, some 20 centimetres high, its end shredded and rent asunder. "Curiouser and curiouser," the doctor muttered, stroking his chin. Romana was similarly nonplussed, and so decided to examine the surrounding undamaged plants for clues.
Strange indeed.
She agreed, looking up.
If these plants do have a natural enemy, they do seem unusually vulnerable. No thorns or other defensive strategies evident. They do have some thin vine-like appendages which lack leaves or any other apparent purpose. Perhaps they simply carry sap. And what defenses they have are purely biochemical.
The doctor stroked his nose with his forefinger. "You may well be correct," he muttered slowly. Then he suddenly brightened. "Still, whatever vicious herbivore is threatening these poor things should be no concern to us, animals as we are," he said with a mischievous grin. Romana looked a little annoyed at being labelled an animal, as the doctor had impishly hoped, but obviously could find no technical objection to the description. That did not dissuade her from finding at least one fly in the doctor's ointment.
Unless, of course, we run into the herbivore's hunter,
she pointed out. The doctor chuckled, shaking his head. "Well, unless you really are determined to cut our holiday short, I think I've found something a little more positive and concrete to capture our attention. Look over there." This last statement was made with a joyous cry, and his finger stabbed across the meadow. It had been late morning when they had left the TARDIS, but by now the sun, whichever it was reaching its zenith. Its midday beams warmed the Time Lords with some strength, while simultaneously illuminating the surrounding countryside to its maximum. Following the doctor's finger, maybe some 200 metres distant, was perhaps the closest feature of geographical significance upon the plain. A very small, low rise or hillock, no more than 20 metres in diameter, and probably rising no higher than 5 metres at its peak. It was, like the rest of the meadow, covered in bushes. Romana gave a soft, slow, and sarcastic round of applause.
Congratulations. You must have found this region's Everest, or perhaps they suffer from a giant mole infestation.
The doctor sighed heavily, but could not stifle a smile. "Well, if there are giant moles, this one clearly hasn't been here for quite some time, as the mound is covered in bushes. But those bushes were what actually caught my eye. Look again, more closely, Romana," he suggested. With the merest hint of a raised eyebrow, she peered again at the rise.
"Oh!"
she said suddenly, with slight surprise.
"Those bushes have red flowers."
The doctor exuded mocking graciousness. "A small variation, I'll grant you, but variety is the spice of life. Worth a look, wouldn't you agree?" Romana, in her turn, exuded weary indulgence.
"Who am I to disagree? Lead on, MacDoc."
She prompted with a twisted smile. Barely had they taken one pace than they were halted by a snapping crash behind them. They spun on their heels and stared in horror at the disaster unfolding there. The TARDIS lay on its back among crushed foliage, its doors, while still closed, pointing uselessly skywards. Not that the Time Lords could see much of the crushed foliage. Their view of this and the TARDIS was largely blocked by those plants still standing surrounding the blue box. And climbing it. No slow and steady march of nature this. The white-flowered bushes were actively and visibly mobile. They flung their vine-like tendrils up the sides of the prostrate time machine, and it was with these that they must have pulled it over. This could only have been achieved through sheer mass, a concerted effort and pure weight of numbers. Such was their desire to drag it down that many of the plants were now free of the soil altogether, their lower stems and roots become legs with which they mounted the cabinet. In a somewhat confusing twist, these higher climbers were themselves being grabbed by those lower down and seemed in the process of being pulled apart, in spite of their common goal. The Doctor and Romana stared aghast for a moment before wordlessly agreeing to rescue their stricken vessel. Barely had they pushed a metre through the nearest plants when these began to rustle in apparent agitation. Adding to their rising dread, the Time Lords realised that there were words hidden in the rasping sibilant sounds. Though poorly formed and indistinct, the noises were undeniably a language, albeit only one word repeated harshly and incessantly. Overshadowed. Romana and the Doctor had barely exchanged a single glance before they were under attack. Branches of the nearest bushes reached towards them, seeking to ensnare their legs and arms. As they struggled against these, tearing themselves free again and again, they found these leafy limbs had infinite reinforcements. And then the second prong came. Those thin, vicious tendrils now snaked towards the Time Lords, circling around their shoulders and chests. And throats. The Doctor and Romana choked and struggled for breath as they tore at these living nooses with their hands and fingers. They enjoyed only marginal and fleeting success as the torn vines were quickly replenished.
Doctor!
Romana coughed out desperately.
Why are they doing this? What can we do?
The Doctor found it hard to concentrate on these questions as his eyes were bulging and his face becoming scarlet. He clawed off the latest vine attack and spluttered as he frantically filled his lungs. A vague idea rattled around his oxygen-starved brain and found connection with an unlikely strategy. "Romana!" he rasped. "Get down! Lie flat!" Romana's eyes widened at this latest insanity.
Doctor, are you mad? You're helping these plants? That's exactly what they want us to do. Permanently.
The Doctor nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly! Trust me, it's the only way!" With that he grabbed Romana's arm and threw himself at the ground. He did not miss. The last thing he noticed on his way down, before the surrounding foliage obscured his view, was that distant hillock of red blossoms. The Doctor and Romana now lay side by side on the soil and crushed plant life, staring at one another. Much to their surprise and obvious relief, the disturbance in the flora subsided. Even the few vines still ensnaring them uncoiled and snaked away. The Doctor shook his head, chuckling ruefully. "Tall poppies," he muttered to himself. Romana frowned at him.
What are you talking about?
She grumbled at her fellow traveller. The Doctor grinned. "Oh, just an old Earth expression." Romana rolled her eyes.
Of course it is. Anyway, more importantly, how did you know this would work? And how are we ever going to get back to the TARDIS from down here?
The Doctor decided to tackle the questions in order. These plants clearly can't abide anything outshining them, including themselves, it seems. Romana nodded her understanding, but gestured for the Doctor to elaborate. He duly obliged. "They are clearly very jealous of their resources and cannot stomach anyone or anything better off than themselves. And so, if anything threatens to overshadow them, quite literally in this case, they tear it down and destroy it utterly, thereby avoiding competition and ensuring the uniformity you see around us." Romana smiled with grim realization.
Ah, so that's why they all share the same limited height. No external gardener required. They simply tear themselves down if one gets too uppity.
The doctor spread his hands in agreement, as best he could given his prone position. In this Valley of the Blind, the one-eyed man isn't king, he's defenestrated.
So that first incident I saw, probably one over-ambitious plant being dealt with, yes? The plant who would be king?
Romana deduced. Undoubtedly, the doctor agreed. But even those bushes who had climbed the TARDIS, the better to bring it down, were, in their turn, attacked for their temerity.
A fascinating, albeit primitive culture,
Romana pronounced. The doctor frowned and looked thoughtful, but for now said nothing. Although still lying on her side, and therefore as constricted as the doctor, Romana did her best to clap her hands briskly.
Interesting as this study in sentient horticulture undoubtedly is, this still leaves the question of how to get back to the TARDIS unanswered.
The doctor shook his head. No, I feel the answers to the first question may well impact upon the second, even if the connections may currently be obscure. These creatures do indeed seem primitive. They make, say, the inhabitants of Earth 100,000 BC look positively erudite. Nevertheless, they do remind me a little of similar organisms I'm sure I have met, who were far more civilized. Romana waggled her horizontal head noncommittally.
While you may be onto something, until you can be more specific, I feel we should circle back to the problem of our ship, and our not being on it.
The doctor frowned and pursed his lips. I think we should head towards the hill we saw. Romana cried out in exasperation.
What? Not only is it one hell of a time to play a hunch, it may well be in entirely the wrong direction. Literally, that hillock is even further from the TARDIS than we are now.
The doctor looked uncomfortable, but would not be so easily dissuaded. Romana, hear me out. Even if we could reach the TARDIS, once there we would have to rise to stand any chance of reaching the doors. And we already know what will happen when we try. Romana looked far from convinced.
But what will we gain from the Red Hill, assuming we can get there at all?
Aid, Romana, the doctor said grimly. We need help, a strength beyond our own. Those red plants stand upon high ground. How? What protects them from the slings and arrows of outraged vegetables? For better or worse, that is where our answers lie. Romana raised an eyebrow.
Well, let's hope for better. And with that in mind, how do you suggest we proceed? I can't see a walk in the country working out so well now.
The doctor gave a twisted smile. A walk, perhaps not. But I'm reminded of one of your other skills, one you demonstrated both on Cairo and Aquathi. A smile grew upon Romana's face.
The playing fields of Eton,
She said wistfully.
You want us to army crawl there?
The doctor nodded.
Do you remember the direction?
Romana asked with the merest wisp of scepticism. Surprisingly, the doctor caught it and raised an eyebrow. I saw it as we dived. I'm fairly certain I've a good bearing, he said with worrying confidence.
Fairly certain?
Romana noted wryly.
I'm utterly assured then.
With a slight harumph, the doctor began to lead the way towards, they hoped, the mysterious mound. Crawling proved almost as tiring as walking, it transpired. While there were fewer branches at ground level, the stems were still closely packed, and their spread-eagled motions far from effortless. Nevertheless, it seemed they were making good progress, though they dared not rise to take a peek, lest they encouraged another attack. By my estimation, we're over halfway there, the doctor called back cheerily, looking over his shoulder as best he could. Romana nodded curtly.
I concur,
was her determined assessment. Inspired by their success so far, they managed to pick up the pace. A rustling broke out amongst the white blooms overhead.
Doctor, what is that?
Romana hissed as they scrabbled frantically onwards. I've got a bad feeling about this, the doctor muttered as they squirmed. I think we'd best make all possible haste, he then cried more loudly.
I'm not sure I can wiggle any faster,
Romana yelled in response. Nevertheless, she did her best to comply. The shaking and rattling in the foliage only increased. Once again, a word became apparent to the Time Lords, only this time ominously different.
Overtaken. Overtaken.
Romana gasped as her progress was suddenly and violently halted. A pale green tendril had shot out from one of the nearest bushes and lassoed her left ankle with terrifying tenacity. The doctor wriggled back to help her, but then found himself similarly ensnared about his right wrist. "Romana!" he grunted as they struggled against these latest entanglements. "I fear I've made a fatal error." Romana looked up from the vine she was currently wrestling with.
Really? Have we been heading the wrong way all along?
The doctor shook his head as he too tore at the twisting tendrils. No, not in that," he said a little tetchily. "I mean when I said we should speed up. I'm afraid I only succeeded in waking a new jealousy in our petty plants. We were too mobile for them, and they could not stand to be outdone." The two Time Lords continued their struggle against the writhing, thrashing, probing onslaught.
They don't seem to be easing off this time.
Romana observed desperately as she fought. The doctor was also forced to maintain his slapping, tearing defense as he spoke. "So it seems," he gasped in agreement. "It appears they have a memory and can hold a grudge. I fear there will be no forgiveness this time."
Urk!
Romana choked as a vine enveloped her neck. She ripped it free, but it was clear she was beginning to tire.
Doctor, what can we do?
She managed to hiss out. The doctor's expression was an odd blend of physical exertion and thoughtful introspection. Then his eyes sprang wide as he was seized by an idea and another vine. Wresting the latter free, he turned his head to look Romana in the eyes. "We must stand up!" he rasped excitedly. Romana could not help but roll her eyes.
But that will only make things worse. Aren't they angry enough already?
The doctor waggled his head. "No, we must stand tall. It's the only way." Romana looked far from convinced, but, finding no better alternative, nodded her reluctant assent. The two Time Lords redoubled their efforts, tearing themselves and each other free from their assailants' grasps. As they did so, they struggled to rise. Upon reaching their knees, they noticed a change in the rustling. The thrashing became more vicious, and their utterances more verbose.
Overshadowed. Overtaken. Overtaken. Overshadowed.
We only seem to be making matters worse.
Romana noted grimly. Still fighting and struggling, the doctor frowned determinedly. "Take heart, Romana! Rise up! Rise up!" he encouraged. Finally they both stood, each with an arm about the shoulder of the other for added stability. They swiped and tore at the enraged alien entities as they struggled to remain upright. They could see they were now only 20 meters from the hillock covered in red-flowered bushes. It was also clear they could make no more progress towards it.
What now, Doctor?
Romana insisted as they battled. The doctor was squinting at those red blooms, looking distracted and puzzled. "Could it be?" he mused to himself. "No, impossible." He turned to Romana. "I have an idea," he said a little uncertainly.
Just get on with it.
She insisted. With a shrug, the doctor complied. "We come in peace!" he yelled at the hill.
Shoot to kill.
Romana muttered grumpily. The white-flowered bushes continued to attack them, and the Time Lords were hard-pressed to keep their feet. The red bushes were as motionless as any garden on a beautiful summer day. "We need your help!" the doctor cried desperately. His knees began to buckle under the ongoing assault. Romana grabbed his arms to steady him, but could feel her own legs failing even then. There came a whistling sound, like a rope being cast. This was immediately followed by a crash, accompanied by the sound of snapping foliage. While still struggling with their horde of snowy-petalled savages, both Time Lords turned their heads in the direction of this new commotion. Something was finally happening near the red bushes. An unseen mass had been thrown into the white plants from the edge of the hill, crushing a trail at least 4 meters long through those homogeneous entities. There was a further slithering rustling as whatever had made this gash was withdrawn back towards the hillock. It was a long, leafy branch, almost like a length of ivy. and it was attached to one of the red-flowered beings. It was obviously part of the plant, as it coiled this extension up into a circle held aloft amongst other more usual-looking branches. Now it let it fly once again, and as it did so, it took a step forwards. Almost simultaneously, two of its crimson-crowned companions to either side mimicked its action, widening the channel which had been created. Again and again, these thrashing assaults were delivered, accompanied by a steady progress into the field of white. The three red bushes were marching towards the Time Lords.
First we are harried by the jackals of the plant kingdom. Now we have woken the wolves, and they have come to take the prey.
Romana noted sourly as she continued her own struggle with the plants of the plain. The doctor wrestled no less energetically himself, frowning, but made no further comment at that time. Ever onwards strode the Crimson Avengers, closer and closer to the doctor and Romana. Their mode of perambulation had to be largely assumed, as the surrounding flora blocked their lower extremities. Nevertheless, it seemed likely that they had withdrawn their roots from the soil to move freely, much as the white bushes who had climbed the TARDIS had done. One of the red plant's vines flashed forward again, so close to the doctor now that it nicked his cheek. He realized that this appendage, unlike the tendrils of the white plants, not only had leaves, but thorns.
It seems our wolves have teeth,
the doctor noted as he patted his wound briefly with his fingers. With a rasping, tearing chorus, all the remaining white bushes between the Time Lords and their new russet interlopers were torn away. Now there was nothing between the Gallifreyans and this new threat. These latest arrivals looked quite rosebush-like seen up close, with some differences from the more numerous white plants surrounding them. Nevertheless, there were many similarities too. Like their more pallid, smoother rivals, these new creatures had no eyes, ears, heads, or any other means of sensing and interacting with their surroundings beyond their obvious mobility. And yet they gave every impression of staring at the two Time Lords almost expectantly. Now a fresh rustling arose.
"We are Risha,"
the plant whispered to them.
Yes!
The doctor cried triumphantly, snapping his fingers in front of him. The effect was somewhat spoiled as a nearby white-flowered bush succeeded in snaring that same hand in a well-cast creeper. The red bush immediately in front of him helpfully pulled away the intrusive tendril, tearing it to pieces. Meanwhile, Romana turned to face the doctor in stunned amazement.
Doctor, what is it? Why do you look so pleased with yourself?
I knew it!
He cried with continued jubilation.
At least I suspected it. This is Risha.
Romana frowned at the doctor.
Yes, that's what it said. And yet it tells us nothing.
No,
the doctor said, shaking his head.
she is known to me. A great friend, in fact.
"We do not know what you are, strange tall animals.
The red plant rustled.
But you are not safe here. Come to our home. Come to Sanctuary."
The doctor looked a little surprised, even flustered by this lack of recognition from their leafy rescuer. Nevertheless, he nodded his grateful understanding to the creature. The white-headed plant still snatched and grasped both at the Time Lords and their saviours. Indeed, the white bushes began a counterattack in order to close the channel they were now traversing. However, with the red bushes and Gallifreyans' combined efforts, they finally reached the base of the hill and its concentration of that same red-bedecked flora. The three original red bushes lined up behind the doctor and Romana, linking their fronds with each other and with those already on the hill, forming a shield between the two Time Lords and the white blooms on the plain.
"Go to the peak of the hill,"
The central plant, presumably Risha, urged.
"We shall meet you there."
Slightly bemused as to how leaving Risha here would allow her to meet them there, the Time Lords complied without complaint. As they trudged up the slope, Romana noticed something about its inhabitants.
Even taking the angle of the ground into account,
She began.
there does seem to be more variation in the heights of these new leafy individuals.
The doctor nodded, smiling slightly.
You know, I think you may be right.
Nothing dramatic,
Romana continued.
only an inch or two in stature or girth, but definitely variety.
The doctor grunted his further affirmation, but said no more for now. They arrived at the centre of the hill. At the very highest point stood a single bush with a little more space around it than the others, a hint, perhaps, of some special identity or status.
"Greetings, strangers,"
She rustled at them.
"We are glad you have arrived unharmed to Sanctuary. I am Risha."
The doctor and Romana exchanged quizzical glances. Romana then gave a skew smile and leaned towards the doctor.
Can't we just call you Bruce?
She whispered impishly behind her hand. The doctor was so taken by surprise by the unexpected reference that he gave a choked snort. He rapidly recovered his composure and addressed the new Risha.
We are most grateful for your timely rescue.
He began cordially.
By another Risha?
His final words were posed as a question. The current Risha swayed towards the doctor and Romana.
"Sadly, we are all named Risha here now,"
she whispered softly.
"I will explain all I can in due time. But first, who are you?"
The doctor inclined his head graciously.
Of course, how rude of me. I am the doctor, and this is Michael Baldwin.
Romana narrowed her eyes at the doctor and pursed her lips, but was also smothering a smile.
"Well met then, creatures, Doctor and Michael,"
Risha returned.
"But what are you? And how did you come to be here? We saw that blue object growing strangely and suddenly upon the plain among the forebears. Saw you disperse from it. What manner of animals are you?"
We are explorers.
Romana responded. Risha tilted her branches but said nothing. The Time Lords realized her attitude was one of confusion.
We travel from place to place in order to see what we can see and learn more about the universe.
The doctor explained. Risha swayed forwards, nodding.
"So, that is your purpose,"
she said with satisfaction.
"I understand."
The doctor held up a hand, then slowly reached inside his jacket and withdrew his sonic screwdriver.
To that end, would you mind if I scanned you with this? It is perfectly painless and harmless,
he said calmly and reassuringly. Risha swayed her fronds forward in agreement. The doctor scanned first the Risha before them, then swept wider to encompass the many similar plants of the same type. He examined the results.
Ah, well, that explains a lot,
he said to himself with a knowing bob of his head.
What is it, Doctor?
Romana asked.
What have you found?
The doctor turned to face his companion.
I now know why the first Risha, indeed any of them, failed to recognize me. They are far too young. In fact, they were all practically born yesterday, evolutionarily speaking. Not one is more than 100 years old. The Risha I knew was eons in the future and also far more scientifically developed as a consequence. These are mere babes in the woods.
Romana shook her head, smiling wearily.
You do seem to make a habit of running into your friends in the wrong order,
she teased. The doctor harumphed.
Merely one of the everyday pitfalls of time travel,
he said airily.
Disorganized time travel,
Romana added. The doctor shook his head impatiently and returned his attention to the chief Risha.
You showed more variety than the plants of the plain. I must say it surprises me to learn you're all clones of the same individual. You called the white-flowered ones the forebears before. How is it you came to be, and more specifically, to be so isolated up here?
Risha swayed forward in acknowledgement of his question.
"Yes, of course. My kind, our kind, only recently came to be, born of the population of the white plants, but as you can see, obviously different. At first, there were several individuals of this new species, and they were untroubled for a while. You see, we were shorter at first."
Romana nodded her understanding.
You kept your heads down,
she noted grimly. Risha rustled in agreement.
"But then we started to outgrow the forebears. Not by much, but enough to attract their attention and their ire. They noticed our other unique attributes, our red flowers, our thorns, our greater mobility. They hissed and screamed in indignation and began attacking us wherever they found us, dragging us down by sheer weight of numbers.
The doctor shook his head sadly. A dislike for the unlike, he said with a sigh.
Yes,
Risha agreed.
they hunted us down mercilessly. There was no reasoning with them. They lacked the cognitive powers to even understand such discourse. Yet another difference between our species, seeming to seal our fate.
Then how did you survive?
Romana asked with concern.
Some of us grew upon this hill.
Risha began, clearly carrying a heavy sorrow.
When the fighting began, myself and the others of my kind here were able to make a stand. We fought back and tore apart those of the forebears we lived among. We tried to propagate as fast as possible, to build up our numbers and strengthen our defense. The fighting went back and forth for years. We would normally procreate through pollen and seeds, cross-fertilizing. But the war made this increasingly impossible. We resorted to our secondary means of reproduction, asexually through runners. By pure chance, I was at the peak of this hill, while my brothers and sisters were lower down the slope. Over the years, more and more were lost from the outer edges, until, at last, only I survived, myself and my copies.
The two Time Lords nodded sympathetically. I take it peace broke out eventually? The doctor asked. Risha waggled her fronds noncommittally.
A piece of necessity alone, as far as the forebears are concerned. They lost too many of themselves in the fight to take the hill. Ultimately, it proved too costly for even their dull senses to bear. Finally, after so many years, they just gave up attacking the hill.
And so, Sanctuary was born.
Romana noted.
And we are most grateful for that, even though I fear we cannot ourselves live here forever.
Risha waved her understanding.
Naturally. As animals, you doubtless have specific needs and resource requirements not provided by our habitat.
The doctor inclined his head in agreement. Indeed. Unfortunately, we need that blue box you saw us disembark from. The same blue box which is now entirely covered by the jealous plants of the plain. Risha remained quiet for several long moments, seeming to study the two aliens before her. Then she shook as a decision was made.
It would be costly,
she began cautiously.
but we can recover it from the forebears for you.
The doctor spread his hands wide in surprise and shock. Costly indeed, he agreed in amazement. And one which we could never repay. You would lose much, and all for complete strangers. Risha waved her branches in disagreement.
Perhaps we are not so much strangers as you believe. We may be closer than you think. And perhaps you've already paid in advance.
With that, a different manner of rustling emanated from the chief Risha. This was picked up by those around her, radiating outwards in a wave from the peak of the hill to reach all the red bushes in a very short time. Clearly, a plan had been hatched and was already afoot. A rank of Rishas at the base of the hill nearest the toppled TARDIS launched their thorn-clad vines into the white-flowered bushes next to them. This attack was so swift, efficient, and unexpected that it tore a trench into the forebears 6 meters wide and 2 deep. The red bushes stepped into this breach and continued their attack. Meanwhile, others of the Rishas stepped forward to fill the gap created. Now the dull senses of the white bushes were finally roused, as was their not inconsiderable ferocity. Battle was truly underway. The doctor and Romana looked on in horror as leaves and branches flew and the sap flowed.
Another War of the Roses.
The doctor heard Romana say. He turned to see if she had intended that as a sick joke, but instead saw his own distress reflected in her eyes. How can we ever repay such an appalling debt? The doctor cried as he surveyed the ongoing destruction. Risha shook her stems slowly and sadly.
Do not concern yourself,
She said gently.
as I said, all costs are already paid.
But how?
Romana asked, as aghast as the doctor.
You have given us more than you know.
Risha told them.
Inspiration and a future.
The doctor looked far from convinced, but spread his arms wide, inviting her to elaborate.
You called yourself explorers.
She explained, her voice somehow evoking the hint of a smile.
And we realized we too could explore far and wide beyond these troubled lands, to the hills and mountains beyond.
The doctor and Romana both frowned thoughtfully.
Your earlier rescue, and now the rescuing of your blue container, solidified the means of our exploration within our minds.
Risha continued.
We shall send exploring parties forth to see new lands, with hope we can propagate there more normally. Who knows? Perhaps even discover more of our kind who survive there even now, and our civilization shall thrive.
Still frowning, the doctor and Romana turned their attention back to the war on the plain. By now, the red bush-filled trench had reached the TARDIS. Those forebears covering it were being systematically pulled apart. The doctor turned his creased visage back upon the Chief Risha. Do you intend to eliminate all the forebears? He asked grimly. Risha's branches stuck out straight from her central stem, shaking, her own display of shock and horror.
Of course not. That would be monstrous and a supreme folly. They are part of our biosphere, a vital part of the interplay of all life forms upon the planet. They are the mulch beneath our roots. They cannot disappear. The bees, for one, would be very disappointed.
Almost as if on cue, a red and black striped lozenge-shaped insect flew out of one of Risha's own flowers and buzzed happily on its way. The doctor shook his head, chuckling. Of course, he said, smiling. The bees. I'd forgotten. Yes, naturally, you're right. I predict you and they, those busy buzzing brain boxes, will become even firmer friends in the future. Romana looked quizzically at the doctor, sensing there was something left unsaid. But for now, she decided to let it remain that way. Instead, both Time Lords returned their attention to the TARDIS, which had just begun its slow drag towards the hill. They would clearly be here for a little while longer. Romana leaned towards the doctor.
Doctor, you do know I trust your intuitions? Value them most highly, in fact. It's just the scientist in me which cries in alarm whenever we have to rely on them.
The doctor cocked his head at her, a little surprised. Dear Romana, think nothing of it, he offered, smiling. Believe me when I tell you that my own inner academic cries out just as loudly, and it is with equal trepidation that I trust that other whispering demon. Then his manner became more serious. But I learned long ago that bad stuff happens when it's ignored. And so I pay it heed, but only when absolutely necessary. Romana gave a twisted smile.
In moments of high anxiety?
The doctor returned the grin. Oh, the very tallest of terrors.
Or the lowest of creeping concerns?
Romana retorted. Sometimes even then. But ultimately, I find it helps us, to stand tall and rise above those distractions seeking to drag us down, and thereby, ultimately, gain a clearer perspective. Romana nodded slowly at the doctor, smiling her unreserved agreement. Together, they watched the scraping, crawling progress of the TARDIS, mirrored in the heavens by the slowly setting sun.
Masters, mistresses, the Doctor requires materials in order to maintain the TARDIS and ensure continued functionality. He similarly requires carbon-based comestibles to sustain his own biological functions and existence. Master would never say this, but he requires aid beyond that supplied by this unit in order to acquire these. To aid the Doctor in his various tasks and creations, this can be most effectively achieved via Patreon or Substack subscriptions, or through donations directly to PayPal. Or if you desire physical goods in return for your contributions, written accounts of my travels with the Doctor are also available on Amazon. Links are in the description below. Thank you, masters, mistresses.